All right. Well, hi, everybody. And we got just a few people are already on. So we'll be waiting for everyone to get on. I know most of you probably know me, but I'm Zach with LeadSimple, and I will be running the webinar today. And the topic is starting with processes from scratch. And like the slide says, we were going over a framework for building processes. Okay, so this is going to be more of a workshop. We're actually going to dive into working through the move-in process today, and that will be after we talk about kind of this abstraction and framework for how you build processes. So again, we're going to wait. Usually we wait about 4 or 5 minutes for everyone to jump on. So we will do that. If you guys want to pipe up and say where you're coming from, that's always awesome to hear. I hope everyone's staying healthy and well from wherever you are in the world. And yeah, I'll go over some more things after we get more people on and make sure I don't have to repeat myself too much. But if you just want to let me know that you're here and that you're coming in, you can just type in the chat and just let me know. That'd be great. Also, if you have any questions along the way, I just want to make sure you know that you can ask those in the Ask a Question little tab. I believe it's at the bottom of your guys' screen. So as we go through, you can ask questions there. So feel free to pipe up in the chat and let me know where you guys are coming in from. And we'll get started diving into the slides here in 2 or 3 minutes as we wait for more people to jump on. Hi, Claire. Great. Oh, and by the way, I'm in Portland, Oregon. So right over here on the West Coast. Nice, Central Virginia, Bay Area, cool. All right, well, like I said, today we're going to be diving into looking at more, we're going to be taking a step back, and some of our webinars that if you guys have been on a variety of different topics. We'll include in the follow-up link to the list of all of them if you want to go back and watch. But we decided today to actually back up, and we're going to dive into more of a framework and how do you really think about processes. And this will likely be something that you would come back to frequently to work through. And we are planning here at LeadSimple to continue to push content like this to help everyone really think about their business as we talk about systematizing it and moving from basically everything in people's heads onto paper and then into a software platform that actually supports that. So again, we're going to wait just 1 or 2 more minutes for a few people to jump on, and then we'll dive in. I think there may have been a little bit of confusion on when this webinar was starting. So thankfully you guys saw that it's actually at 11. That's when we told everybody. So we'll see, people might be jumping on a little bit later. All right, getting a few more. All right, if you're just jumping on, you can just let me know where you're popping in from. All right. Yeah, 2:30. So I think we had a little bit of a mess up there. So that won't happen again. It was supposed to start at 2 Eastern, 11 PST. So that's why we're getting going now. Okay, so we got a few more people. I don't want to wait anymore. And we're just going to dive in. And obviously, we're going to have a recording for this. Anyone can go back and watch it after the fact, as well as you can share it with anyone. And we'll have follow-up at the end as well. All right, so as far as the outline for today, again, we're talking about a framework for building processes. So this is somewhat of an abstraction. It's really a thought process around taking a process and moving it from everything that's just in your head to paper and then into LeadSimple or a software system that supports building processes. Again, we'll have the recording accessible at this URL and sent to everyone afterwards. We'll have this slide deck as well sent to everyone, and the process worksheet that we're going to be going over sent to everyone as well. All right, so now that we're ready, we're going to dive in. and start talking about this framework for thinking about processes. So here we go. When you think about processes, well, before you start, I just skipped this slide. Before you start, we need to choose a process, all right? So the first thing that you need to do is actually pick the process that you're going to work on. And we're going to talk about another important thing. And this may seem simplistic, and you might be like, yeah, I'm way ahead of you. But you'll realize that thinking through this and taking this framework will be helpful, even if you're a bit more experienced with doing processes. So we need to pick our process, the one we're going to work on. Today, we're going to be looking more at the move-in process, but this framework would be applicable to all the processes that you would be defining for your company. 2, we're going to work on one process at a time, okay? It's hard sometimes to, it can be very overwhelming to not take one at a time. You're basically like, we're going to systematize our entire business and we're going to take everyone's process, we're going to do it. It's far better to take it piecemeal, one at a time, even though there's steps that are included in other processes and processes tied together. You'll get to the point where you can link everything together, but you need to focus on defining one at a time. Okay. Another thing to do is make sure that you don't have to make the process perfect the first time through, especially if this is one of the first times you've done this. Focusing on perfection will mean you will never get across the finish line. I can do that, and I have done that in the past, and it's usually not good. So I have been encouraging everyone basically to not be perfectionistic, especially with your first time through, because the point is to get a usable process across the finish line so that your company can start using it, and you'll be able to infinitely improve on it in the future. Okay, so keep that in mind. It does not have to be perfect right off the bat. All right, so the first thing that we start with when we're thinking about a process is we start with the goal. I don't know if any of you read Simon Sinek's book, Start With Why, but that's pretty much the point here. I'd highly recommend that book if you haven't read it. But ultimately, what is the goal? What is the why of this process? Why do we even do it in our business? And what is the desired outcome of this process? Okay, so that's where we're going to start. I know it sounds a little bit abstract. Once we get into the worksheet, we'll actually see how that would come out for a move-in process. But just to get yourself thinking on that, the move-in process purpose would be to take a tenant, and the goal would be to take a tenant that's signed a lease, move them into the property successfully, and secure them as a happy tenant for the duration and maybe extension of their lease. Okay, so there's succinct ways to say it, but basically shrinking it down, what is the goal of this process? Next, we need to define the process triggers. Okay, so many of you have heard about triggering processes, and if you went through to any workshops or conferences on this, this is generally where you're basically talking about what are all the events that can trigger a process. And this is super important to know up front. As we're talking about move-ins, then the main things that are going to trigger this process is a signed lease or the lease renewal process. There may be other things, but those are the two that strike me off the top of my head, and we'll get into that in the worksheet. So once you have the process triggers, then you move to defining the process outcomes. Okay, so make sure to include undesired outcomes like management cancels or tenant moving out. You also want to include outcomes that are not just the golden path here. So for a tenant move-in, for example, we would have the tenant moved in successfully, or the tenant flaked out and didn't complete the move-in, or there's something, there may be a bucket as well. You can think about buckets of outcomes where there was something happened that was, so it usually would be tenant flaked out, tenant moved in, and I'm not actually coming up with any others right now. Those are really the main outcomes. The owner generally doesn't cancel after the tenant has signed the lease at the end of the lease renewal process. So the move-in's kicked off by that. Those are the two likely outcomes that would come from a move out, for example. But this would apply to every process that you're thinking about. Define the outcomes as the third step. Fourth step is a really important one. Document any child or sub-processes related and connected to this process. So one very common thing when people start systematizing their business and thinking about processes is they take a process. We take a move-in, for example, which is what we're going to be looking at today. And a move-in really includes multiple processes. And a common thing that we see people do is they build out all the steps and put them all into one process when there's really reusable sections that could be broken out into their own processes so that you can use them and then connect them together. So LeadSimple has great support to enable you to trigger processes from other processes and track that. So a great example in move-in would be you probably have an inspection. So you're going to have a move-in inspection, and that inspection likely would trigger work orders. Okay, so that's an example of sub-processes that can be separate but still tracked and connected to the move-in process. When you can then use the work orders for other processes and trigger it from other processes. Inspections can be triggered from different processes. Your move out inspection might be exactly the same as the move-in inspection. If that's the case, then they should be in a reusable inspection checklist. And really how you segment that is if a process, the steps are different enough, if your inspection for move-ins is a lot different than your move out, then they should just be tasks within each individual process. Move-ins and move-out steps should be within the move-in and move-out process. If they are almost exactly the same, then they should be in their own inspections process. So as you think about that, you may be able to create a reusable processes, and those would be called child or sub processes that connect into this process. Another thing, like I mentioned at the beginning, the lease renewal process could be a process, and it would trigger this move-in process. So move-in would technically be a child of lease renewals. So that's one way to think about that. Again, I want to emphasize too, I want you guys to ask any questions you have along the way. There's an ask a question little tab that you can check. You can either type into chat if you have a question and Matt or I will answer, or you can ask an official question right in the ask a question section and people can vote on which questions they want answered first. So I just want to let you know, I will be stopping along the way to check if you guys have questions and we can answer them. All right. So now that we've documented the child processes, in the case of move-in, we'll look at that in the worksheet. It's probably going to be inspections and work orders. There may be others, but those are the two I've defined. And then the next thing we look at is we define staff roles. Okay, so who on your team within your staff is involved with this process? So that can be the list of names. If you're a departmental company, then it might be the different departments that you have involved. Basically, we're defining who is going to be part of this process to help us define who the tasks should be assigned to. Okay, so the tasks in LeadSimple could be defined to a department or assignee role, or they could be defined to individuals. All right, so we support both options. And so it should work in whatever case, in whichever stage your company's at. I know some people like departments, some people just have individuals that are filling each role or maybe multiple roles. So a good example of that is in the move-in process, we're probably going to have leasing agent, maybe maintenance coordinator, and those could just be people, or they could be assignee roles, which could be assigned to basically department people within those roles. And then accounting, you might have that. If there's security deposit disposition, stuff like that, that would happen as part of the move-in. That may be complete by the time the lease renewal is complete, but that depends on how you have your process set up, and we'll get into that in the worksheet. So we're going to define the staff roles. Next, we are going to define the customer roles. All right, so this is where it gets cool, particularly in LeadSimple versus any other workflow platform, is we have really first level support for communication segmented to different customer or contact roles. So as we're thinking about, in this case, move-in process, what customers or contacts are involved in this process? The two that come to mind right off the top of my head are owners and tenants. We communicate with owners and we communicate with tenants as part of the move-in process. Now, in the inspection process and work orders, we may be communicating with vendors, and in inspection process, we may be communicating with particular people that would go out and actually inspect the property. If you have a third party doing that, it's really limitless on options. Lease renewal process, like the slide says, involves owners and tenants as well, and a work order would involve tenants and vendors, usually owners as well, for approval. So LeadSimple lets you segment out those roles and target communication towards specific roles. And that's just something to keep in mind, but we're defining who we communicate with in the process, and that will really help us as we define the steps ultimately at the end. The next thing we need to do is we need to choose a deadline. All right, so this is another place where people get tripped up a little bit. And the main question is, how long should this process take? Now, deadlines are important in making sure that work happens in a timely manner. However, don't shoot too high or low with your deadline. It's pretty common for people to shoot for an unrealistic deadline as they are defining their process. Set a deadline that's realistic based on what you actually are doing currently, and then work on improving that over time. Okay, you can always improve later. But if you set if you say that move-ins should be completed, well, move-ins would actually be more relative to the move-in date, which we can get into that. LeadSimple has good support for relative due dates for tasks. But if you are setting an unrealistic time frame for your team, that will just be frustrating because their move-ins will always be overdue, and it doesn't actually reflect reality. So a lot of us want to, in our businesses, believe that one thing is the case when reality is actually another thing. And that's really shown in deadlines. When people say a move-in inspection should be done within 24 hours of when it's scheduled, but actually in real life, it's usually done within two days instead, then that becomes a frustration rather than starting at where you're at currently, what is reality, and then making that better over time and improving on it. So just basically don't lie to yourself, set the appropriate deadline expectation, and we'll get into that in the worksheet. Next is we need to document variability. Now, this is something that's really cool and also supported in LeadSimple. What factors cause this process to vary is the question, okay? So does this process change, here's a good example, on property location or the tenant's eviction history, or whether or not a property is in an HOA? If a property is in an HOA, do we have different steps that apply that in this case? For move-ins, it depends on your company and the different tasks, but ultimately you are defining the variability that commonly happens. Now, you're not going to be able to be exhaustive here, so don't sweat it too much. But what we want to define is enough of the variability that we capture the tasks, and then we can assign, ultimately, once we make it to LeadSimple and actually adding this process, then you can actually have conditional logic that would power those steps so they only apply in the cases when a property, for example, is in an HOA or it's in a particular utility region. You can set that up to be variable and conditional based. So the steps can be conditional based on that. So this is basically your notes, you're writing down, you're brainstorming what happens in real life with this process and what variables affect it. Next, we are going to talk about choosing your stages. All right, now stages is a concept that LeadSimple has, but it's also, it's just common in general. And stages are basically your milestones in this process. So stages, rather than just having a linear task list that's top to bottom, that's not broken up at all, it's really hard, and all it is basically a percentage complete of your massive checklist. We in LeadSimple have chosen to encourage users to break it up into stages. It can be as many or as few as you want, and they can have whatever names you want, but they're basically, think about them as your milestones, your major milestones in the process. Each stage will have a workflow, which is your tasks and steps in that particular stage. And then each stage moves to the next stage in general. And there's a lot of customizability around setting that up, but ultimately here you're talking about major milestones. When we're talking about a lease renewal process, we're going to be actually looking at move-in later, but an example here is good. might have stages of upcoming renewal, renewal in progress, tenant renewed. And then another thing to include is make sure you include workflows or stages for the undesired outcomes. So those are kind of your lost or canceled stages, and they can have workflow associated with them. So that's something to keep in mind as well as you think about the major milestones of your process. All right, again, I know we're going through this, we're talking about a framework, there's probably questions, so if you guys have any, totally want to hear those in feedback, you can post them in chat or under the ask a question section. And again, today we're focusing on the framework for building processes and the worksheet. And we may not have time to actually get into LeadSimple itself and dive into that, so we'll probably look at having a part 2 depending on time today, since we're already 21 minutes in and we haven't made it to worksheet yet. So I just want to give you a heads up on that. We probably will be having a step 2 where we take our worksheet and move it into LeadSimple. All right, getting ahead of myself a little bit. 10. So this is step 10. All right. So all of those previous steps, again, you'll have these slides shared with you so you can go back to them and review them. But step 10 is actually where you start documenting the steps. So you've defined all of the previous steps, and now you are into the actual tasks. And those are going to be broken out into the major milestones or stages that you just defined. Okay, so we've taken this at a really incremental step-by-step approach and a framework for developing your process that should make it a lot simpler and less overwhelming. Now that we're going through each stage, we're documenting all the steps in the that should occur in each one of those stages. And those steps can include triggering other processes. So LeadSimple has first-class support for triggering processes from other processes. So as you think about when an inspection should occur, particularly in a move-in, let's say, then you can actually add a step which will be converted to a task on each individual process for creating that process and assign it to the appropriate person that is supposed to handle that particular process. It could be the person that is doing the process, but ultimately you can then segment and have separate processes that trigger each other and are all connected in that way. So as you're defining steps, keep that in mind. And at this point, you would be ready to plug this into LeadSimple. Okay, so now we've made it through the slides, and you would have followed this outline and this framework along with a worksheet. So now we're actually going to jump into the worksheet. All right, so now that we're in the worksheet, this is our move-in process worksheet. Again, we're gonna share with you this worksheet with actual everything we have defined here, as well as give you a blank template which you could reuse. So that'll be included in our follow-up after the call, and feel free to share it with anyone that you think would appreciate it. So first off, we name our process, pretty simple, move-in. So I'll probably just actually take away process. It's going to be move-ins, and you can hyphenate or just abbreviate too. But move-ins is really the process here. And now we're going through our framework. The first thing that we do, and the worksheet is set up to mirror the framework we just talked about, as defining the goal. Okay, so the goal is stating the objective. All right, so what's the objective of this process? The way I wrote this out was finish final prep to get the property ready for the tenant, collect all necessary documents, and set up the necessary accounts, hand off keys, and move the tenant in. Okay, you try to be as succinct as you can, but you want it to actually represent the outcome and the goal of this process. So what's cool about this is now your team, you're brainstorming with them, everyone's committed to this being the goal of this particular process. And again, as you're pulling all of the steps and tasks out of people's minds, defining the goal at the beginning really helps set a framework and kind of blinders, really, so people were focused on what does this process do, and we don't get as sidetracked into maybe the child processes as well that are not specifically the move-in process. So as we focus on the move-in process, the next thing we need to do is look at triggers. So we need to list any events or other processes that can trigger this process. So we're looking at move-ins. The main things that, from what I was coming up with, and as I've consulted with different companies, the main triggers for move-ins are signed lease, and the lease renewal process is a actual process that would trigger this. Okay, so signing a lease is kind of the trigger, but that could be included in your lease renewal process if that's one that you have worked on and defined. Again, we're not doing steps for the lease renewal process. We're just defining the triggers that could trigger move-ins. So I just wanted to write that process as well as signed lease in the triggers. Now we look at outcomes. All right. So what are the main outcomes? And we talked about this a little bit when I was going through the slides. The ones I have defined are tenant moved in and tenant canceled. So those are pretty much your main outcomes. Either the tenant moves in, great, or they cancel, crap, that's annoying. Now, child processes. That's what we talked about earlier in the slides. Inspection, so your move-in inspection and your work orders. Now, your move-in inspection, you may just include the actual tasks and steps in the move-in if it is not if it's not reusable enough. Okay, so if your move-in inspection is different enough from your move-out inspection, then just include those steps within each of those individual processes. If they are reusable, though, it might be a great idea to have an inspection process that you can reuse. So you can basically update those steps in one place instead of having to update two processes all the time. Work orders, great example of something that's really reusable, and we've seen people be pretty successful with managing them within LeadSimple. So triggering those and tracking them and all the steps associated with them. Now, staff roles. That will be your, in this case, leasing agent, maintenance coordinator, potentially, and you could put names next to these. So if, let's say, Angela, can't type, and Rebecca, the leasing agent, Rebecca, maintenance coordinator, Angela. So you could either have your roles, which would be your departments, or you could have actual names. So you're basically just defining who's involved and what is their role in this process. Then we have contact roles. So these are basically the people that we are communicating with. So what type of contacts are we going to be included in this process? Tenants and owners for move-ins, by far the most common. You may in your company have another one, and if you do, no problem, just put it down, and it can be included when you start defining that process within LeadSimple. Now we're talking about deadlines. All right, so the deadline for a move-in is actually relative, obviously. So it's relative to when the move-in date is set. What's super cool about LeadSimple is we will be able to add a move-in date custom field, and then track, actually set our tasks relative to that date in the process. So I'm not going to have a chance. Again, like I said, we're going to do a part 2 follow-up where we actually take this worksheet and we're going to go into LeadSimple and from scratch build it out. That will be in the next webinar, which all of you will get an invite for as well. But the move-in date, which is based on, it could be set in the lease. So you should have it up front. So when you trigger the process, you should be able to set it. And it's based on when the tenant moved out. And yeah, so basically the way I've defined it is it's all of my tasks are going to be kind of set relative to the move-in date, either before the move-in date or after the move-in date. And then that will define our overall deadline for when we consider this process to be overdue. And then KPIs. This is another important thing as you are tracking your team and helping encourage performance. This wasn't something in the slides, but it's something we've included in the worksheet. But basically, as you think about each process and the people that are in your company that are doing it, you want to think about ways to encourage them and obviously keep track. So KPIs is key performance indicators. And you want to, and what I've found to be most successful is have KPIs that are encouraging to your team. So, and that you can actually track. time to complete is an easy one that's completely tracked within LeadSimple. And you'll have good dashboard reporting on that to keep track of your team. And then you could tie in some incentives within your company to, hey, if you're completing, if you're improving over time, because I can actually see that now based on your move-ins or other processes or all the processes that you're involved with, then there'll be some sort of incentive there in your company. So that's something to track. What are the KPIs of this process? And then notes. One particular thing you need to take note of is what software you're going to be involved, and then any other notes that you want to list here. So obviously PM software is going to be part of this. So whatever PM software you use, property manager, Appfolio, rent, property manager, I said, Propertyware, Appfolio, Rent Manager, Buildium, whatever it is, Yardi. So, and then property listing software. So for a move-in, we'll probably be taking down our listings and delisting that property, and then our CRM as well as email and different. You may have different things listed out here. This is a little bit more of a generic list that I added. So those, and then any other notes that you might want. So this is where you'd be describing your variability, the system is involved, and the pain points. Okay, and the pain points, you don't always, there's another thing, you don't always have to solve those right away. There's, like I said at the beginning, infinite numbers of ways you can actually improve on the process. But guess what? You can't improve on a process until it's starting to be used within your company. So the goal when you're going through each of these processes and you're systematizing your business, and again, you're pulling all these tasks out of people's heads, the goal is to get to the point where it's actually being used by the team and that the team is empowered to suggest and implement changes as you go along. Some companies, they like to take the draconian approach and they define a process and it's like, this is the way it is. And there's definitely going to be steps where it's very much that way. This absolutely has to happen this way because of our values as a company, and follow it very woodenly. Other companies, they really encourage their employees to actually influence the process and improve on it over time. So ultimately, as you're systematizing your business, the system should always improve, reflecting the improvements that you make in your company, and ultimately so you don't stagnate and have your competition take you over. All right, so now we're actually at the point, again, you'd be following the framework. We would be up here at choosing your stages, so we're defining major milestones. I've already done that, and I've actually written some out here, and I want to just jump in and show you what those are. So again, don't stress too much over the names and how you break it out. It can be updated in the future. So try not to overstress again on making your process completely perfect, because it's useless until it's starting to be used by real people in your company. And if you're waiting for perfection, it's not going to happen without improvement after it's being used. So I'd encourage you to back off a little bit and allow it to not be perfect right at first, so that you actually learn and you get data from your team, as well as just noticing everything, and then you can improve on your process over time. It's not like you can't ever edit a process after it's out. I know I'm hitting on that hard, I'm beating a dead horse, but it's really something you see a lot of in different companies, and one of the reasons why they don't make it across the finish line with processes. So the goal of this process is to collect the remaining documents from the tenants and set them up in the PM software. Okay, so you can have a goal or description of each stage. And this is great. Again, this will be the worksheet that you'll get after the call. And then we have this nice table that is very similar to how you actually will set it up in LeadSimple. So it'll be super easy to add this all into LeadSimple after you're done with your brainstorming. But we have our type and description. So we have these different types of tasks. So we have regular task, call, email, meeting, SMS, which would be text, starting of a process, and a trigger. So that'd be starting a process based off a trigger. And then we have delay as well. So if there's a delay, and for move-ins, I would probably be adding a few delays based on the move-in custom date that I've added. Then we define who is the assignee. As we come back up here, you can see that we said leasing agent, we just defined LA and MC. So we can use those down beneath so we don't have to write them out exhaustively. So this could be names. You can have your names of your people or the contact role that this would be associated with. So as you can see, we also have modifiers. All right, so anyone who's, most of you are already familiar with LeadSimple, the lightning bolt means automated. The hand signal means stop. So it's a stop task, which means the workflow will not continue past that task until it is complete. And then we have required tasks, which is that star, which means they will not disappear until they are checked off, even if the user moves to the next stage. And then you can set reminders. And then one icon that's not quite here is conditional logic. So you can also define conditional logic for the steps. But I've left that out actually because you don't have to worry about that quite yet. Those are things you can add and adjust in LeadSimple after you've implemented it there. So now these are some questions. So you can see none of these are stop tasks yet. So this would all get scheduled right away. So copy of signed lease, copy of tenant's driver's license. This is just like really spelling it out. And then the person that's doing the move-in will be required to check it off to say, yep, I do have a copy, and that will be tracked in the activity of that process. So basically define at whatever granularity level you think is good. If you want to just combine all 4 of these into one, totally cool to do that. I decided to keep them separate because I wanted to make sure that no one forgot to make sure we have a driver's license. So you could consolidate it depending on your team, but I was a little bit more specific. Then we have an email to collect the security deposit or first month's rent from the tenant. Some of you may have already done this as part of your lease renewal process. I've chosen to have it right at the beginning of the move-in. But again, that's up to you guys on how you want to define your steps. So we define leasing agent and tenant probably involved with this. It's also a required step. Then we remove the property from the listing sites, create tenant record in the PM software, update property in PM software. And you can have detailed instructions on each one of these tasks. What's cool with Google Docs too is you can always highlight and add comments on the side. So as you guys are brainstorming with your team, I'd encourage you to do that. And then we have utilities set up. Again, your tasks are probably going to look a little bit different than mine, but these are tasks that I pulled from move-in processes that I have consulted on as well. So it's they should be representative of pretty close to what actually happens. And then, as you can see here, we continue on adding. You can continue to add more as well. And then we have our next stage. Okay, so preparing property and handoff. And then we define that's goal. And then you do that for each different stage. Again, I'm going to give this to you guys at the end of the call in the follow-up. So you'll get that and you'll be able to review it. And hopefully this will be a really useful tool when you're brainstorming with your team on your processes before you even make it to LeadSimple. And then by the time you do, it should be far less confusing once you're setting things up. So we found this to be really helpful. And another thing to note too is at LeadSimple, we use LeadSimple for our own processes, and we do follow this process as well. So that's just something to keep in mind. Now what I want to do in the last 5 minutes that we have, actually, we're going to have a follow-up webinar where we actually take this move-in worksheet that I've already written out, and we're just going to start from scratch, go into LeadSimple, create a process type from absolute scratch, and then define the steps, delays, everything. So it'll be more of a workshop. People can follow along, and obviously I'll have the recording afterwards to look at that as well. But what I want to do is jump into LeadSimple really quick. And actually, we're just going to, I don't have a move-in process defined here yet because I was just working on it. We have one in the library, But what I want to do, since we have the second webinar that you guys can all join, I think we'll do it next week probably. Then I just want to jump into the move out and into the settings to just give you a little bit of, from that worksheet, how this will work. And this will be a little bit of a teaser because obviously we'll get into way more detail in the next and take it a bit slower, since I think people have been feeling like it's drinking from a fire hose sometimes when we're going through a webinar. The general tab of your settings for every process type has your process name. We've already defined that, singular name. So each process will be named move out for, but you might want to call the global process move outs. And then what contact roles are part of this process. So we've already defined that. We've already thought through that for your in the worksheet. So you have that, and that framework helps you just jump in here. You can add your contact roles. If you have a more departmental company, it would be great to look at assignee roles like you've already defined in your worksheet. And yeah, you can learn more about those here and how to add them and how that affects how you can assign the individual steps. Then you can define your team. So everyone that you've already defined is involved in this process. Everyone here should be included in your team. So you should add them. And then you get to the stages and workflows. You've already defined the major milestones of your process. So it's pretty easy to jump in here and to add them. Obviously, we're looking at move outs, not our move in. Our next webinar, we're going to actually build it out from scratch, from that from the worksheet that we were just looking at. But this is a move out, which I've already defined in here. But now that we've worked through that worksheet, we've done our framework, it's easy to jump into LeadSimple and add the stages. And then after you've added the stages, you can jump into them and start adding your steps individually the way that you've outlined in your worksheet. So the worksheet's a great way for you to get with your team, to really brainstorm and help pull knowledge out of everyone's heads that's currently all there and define it in a reusable format so that you can really track and move forward with systematizing your business to the point that ultimately it becomes a training manual as well for new hires as you grow. Or if you lose someone, then you won't just lose everything that was in their head. So that's something that's we've seen to be really useful. And also it empowers your team to now have a tool to track their processes properly and help keep them on track. So you can keep track of them and where they're at, as well as making sure that they are able to keep track of their processes themselves. So it's kind of a win-win on that. Again, obviously, most of you are already familiar with the task page, but that's where everyone would be keeping track of the different tasks, and that's global for all the processes that they have outstanding. And it's just probably one of the favorite features of our users. So I know most of you guys already know that. I hope this wasn't too high level for you all, but we basically wanted to back up and talk about how do you really think about processes within your business. And we plan to continue to put out content related to that, help everybody just have a framework. We found it really helpful as we create our own processes, as well as we consult with a lot of companies creating theirs. This is more or less the process that we follow while doing that. So we're providing this to you guys, and I'm hopeful that it's really helpful. I'm looking forward to hearing feedback from you as well. We got 2 questions here, so I'm going to try to grab those really quick. So during that follow-up webinar, this is from Brian. To input this worksheet in the LeadSimple, what process will that be on so I can create my stages and prepare to walk through? All right, we're actually going to do it on the move-in. So that's what we're going to do, Brian. We're going to do it on move-in. So what we just did. And then one quick question from Claire. Can we get a copy of this worksheet? Yes, we're going to have that in the follow-up email as well. So we're right on time, pretty much. I just want to thank everybody for jumping on. I hope it was a little bit of a slower pace. And I'm really looking forward to continue to improve on this process as well, because the worksheet can get improved. It's like any process that we talk about. And as we all look to improve in our different companies and our roles in them, I'm just looking forward to helping with that. And I want to hear from you guys. Feel free to reach out to any of us via the intercom chat if you have any questions or feedback on the webinar or anything. That's one of the fastest ways to reach us. It's within LeadSimple in the bottom right. You'll see a little chat. That's the fastest way. And we just love to hear from you guys and continually improve, just like I talked about. All right, we're right on time. So thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to jumping on next time to take the move-in worksheet and actually just from scratch add it into LeadSimple. All right, see you guys then.